at Hub, we had the conversation that at the end of the day, this is really about our culture, what we want to be as a culture, and a big part of that is we want all of our employees to feel that they belong. So we went from kind of a mouthful title, which at one point was diversity, equity, inclusion, and community. And rather than explaining words, we're much more comfortable explaining our actions. And so we moved to culture and belonging.
Kevin Bradley, welcome to the Life Fulfilled podcast.
Thank you so much, Bernie. It's an honor and a pleasure being here.
Well, it's an honor to have you. I'm looking forward to our conversation. Kevin, you are the Vice President of Culture and Belonging at Hub International, where you're responsible for the oversight of talent, culture, and community DEI strategy. And you're focused on attracting the best diverse teams and talent so you can create and sustain a vibrant, inclusive culture. And for anybody who may not know Hub International, you're a leading provider of very vital services, employee benefits, risk, insurance, retirement, private wealth for thousands and thousands of brands. Not the sexiest services, Kevin, but very vital services to any business. And Kevin, we are both speaking at the upcoming HR Leadership and Wellness Executive Summit happening in October in Atlanta. And there'll be more information on that a little bit later in this episode. But let's get right to it. I invited you here to have a conversation around this concept of the evolution of belonging, how it's been sort of an evolution from DEI to the evolution of belonging. And of course, you are the VP of Culture and Belonging at Hub International. So let's begin with, what is that? What is your role, VP of Culture and Belonging?
So the role is pretty traditional in terms of what a lot of companies had in the past. They called it many things: diversity, diversity and inclusion, inclusion and diversity, inclusion, diversity, equity. It almost at some points became an alphabet soup. But at Hub, we had the conversation that at the end of the day, this is really about our culture, what we want to be as a culture, and a big part of that is we want all of our employees to feel that they belong. So we went from kind of a mouthful title, which at one point was diversity, equity, inclusion, and community. And rather than explaining words, we're much more comfortable explaining our actions. And so we moved to culture and belonging.
Okay. And you made mention of the alphabet soup. So that was the DEIC acronym, right? Diversity, equity, inclusion, and community.
Correct. And again, you'll see many companies had more letters, different letters.
Right.
It got very interesting for some time.
Right. Right. Okay. All right. And then I know that you've made reference to sort of like a new culture. What do you mean by that?
Well, actually, it's not so much a new culture, and it's interesting that the title of this podcast is evolution, because just my opinion, but I think human beings' need to belong has been around since human beings have been around. And I think we've complicated things in this space sometimes. And I look at something I did with my fraternity when they formed a DEI committee, and we went around and around. And then someone had the brilliant idea of going back to the words of our founders. And basically, their simple motto was creating better men for a better world. And so, again, it's not new, but I think it's uncomplicating and unfettering things that we've known for some time and just making it make sense.
So if it's not a new culture, then the one thing that I also know from our previous conversation is that sometimes there's a little bit of a confusion over an overlap between the concept of culture and the concept of community. So you want to kind of speak to the distinction there?
Sure. I think sometimes community, often in the corporate sense, often implies external outreach. And we do that, of course, but for us, community is getting our house in order, ensuring that we have a strong internal culture, while at the same time still being a good corporate citizen locally. So we have community engagement that goes on at almost every region that we have. Our leadership and our employees are good corporate citizens, and they want our communities to be better places. And if we can contribute to that, even better.
So I think what I hear you saying then, Kevin, is that they coexist, right? Culture is internal. It's about, you use the phrase getting and keeping your house in order. So that's an internal focus, whereas community is more external. Do I have that
Yeah,
right?
and I think community is a byproduct of your culture. You could have a company whose culture is almost like a King Midas, and I'm going to hoard my treasures. Or you could have a company whose culture is, you know what, we're going to be a good place to work, but we're also going to be a good neighbor. People are going to want our offices in their community. So I think that they're closely tied, but I think culture drives what kind of community-based organization you are.
The more time I spend in the HR community, the more I realize that they really, just like technology, they have their own set of acronyms, alphabet soup, as you like to say. And there's another one that I remember we discussed, and that's the acronym ERG. I
Mhm.
know what it stands for. Why don't you speak to the meaning and the importance of ERGs?
And again, they're called many different things at many different companies. I've seen ERGs, employee resource groups. That's kind of the oldest acronym that's been around, and some have migrated to BRGs, business resource groups. I've seen dozens of other names. At the end of the day, again, these are communities within the community. And the community, again, I'll define as the company. So these are communities of like-minded people. What I love about the way we do things, yes, we have a Black or African American ERG, but you know what? You don't have to be Black to be a part of it. They're open to everybody. If you have an affinity, if you are just seeking knowledge, if you just want to network, that's a lot of what these groups are around to do. So they're communities, they share their culture and knowledge with the rest of the company, and just nice opportunities to network and engage internally.
Okay, great. I love that. And, we haven't even mentioned my favorite F word, fulfillment, yet. And we're going to get to that a little bit deeper, but you've already reminded me of it in that last comment. And that's just the opportunity to participate in these communities can really feed our fulfillment at so many different levels. But we're going to talk more about that here shortly. Another thing that I know that is important to you is what you call work life harmony. And this starts to really get to that fulfillment connection. Why don't you unpack that for us, Kevin?
Yeah, it's fulfillment, it's engagement, it's belonging. And I think for many, many years, companies, employees have had this quest to have work-life balance. And I was in a workshop, and there was an instructor from West Point actually who said, if you look at the word balance, that kind of connotates 50-50. And if you look at things in a real world sort of way, there's no such thing as work-life balance. It'll never be 50-50. So he suggested something that he called work-life harmony, which means that, you know what, I could go home today and tell my wife and family, I'm going to be kind of a ghost for the next week or so because I've got these projects. They have hard deadlines, they're critical, and I'm going to be just nose to the grindstone. The harmony comes in. I could have the same conversation at work in another week and tell my boss, my kid's on a traveling baseball team. I want to go see them play. I'll answer my calls, but I'm not going to be glued to my desk. So that's not 50-50. It's not an even split, but it's creating that harmony where everything and all those parts of your life are living in harmony, not evenness, not equality, but harmony.
Yeah, I agree. And this is definitely where we have a very strong connection to not just fulfillment in general, Kevin, but fulfillment across what, as you know, I call our five life pillars, right? Health, fitness, career, relationships, and legacy. And this allows us to really have that harmony. Because, I often encounter people who say, well, I'm doing really well in these two pillars and not so great in these other three. And then they just kind of downplay the other three as if they don't they shouldn't even be seeking harmony. We should all be seeking harmony. I'm not saying perfection. It's not what I'm saying. I don't think you're saying that either, right? But harmony so that you can experience fulfillment as you go about working hard on projects and then taking some time to spend with family, as you shared in your example. Join us at the HR Leadership, Wellness, Culture, and Engagement Executive Summits happening October 12th through the 14th in Atlanta, Georgia. This invitation-only experience brings together senior HR professionals from companies like Warner Brothers, Morgan Stanley, Paramount, and more for 3 days of transformative conversations, strategic networking, and actionable insights. You can apply now for a complimentary invitation at the link in the show notes for this episode and become part of the community that's shaping the future of work.
And I think the other thing that happens sometimes is if we take your 5 key life pillars, for example, you might have someone that says, Bernie, I love that. I'm going to grasp that. And then they're operating under the work-life balance mantra, and they try to boil 5 oceans, which, boiling one is impossible. And they try to boil 5 oceans and not working in a more harmonious way to be fulfilled.
Exactly. And that reminds me, Kevin, that just to comment on what I view fulfillment as, I know that I've got a number of new listeners joining the Life Fulfilled podcast, so they maybe have not heard me define it in the past. And for anybody who has heard me define it, you're going to hear it again. And that is that fulfillment is a deeper emotion than happiness. It's associated with achievement. And when we experience fulfillment in something, it could be a big achievement or a small achievement or somewhere in the middle. It gives us this sense of fulfillment. And in most cases, it's immutable. So unlike happiness, which can be fleeting, hey, my favorite sports team won last night or lost last night or whatever the case may be, it's still a temporary happiness, whereas fulfillment is more permanent. And that really allows us to give us perspective as we're working to achieve fulfillment to the extent that we can across the 5 pillars. I remember you shared a story with me, Kevin, if I can jog your memory on it, about how you had some ERG coffee chats, and that resulted in you experiencing some of these fulfillment emotions.
Yeah, and it's some great examples of the difference between that moment of happiness and that much deeper feeling of fulfillment. Our employee groups have what we call coffee chats, and oftentimes it's a speaker, either internal or external, talking about a different topic. And we've had a number of them. And, like any person who's doing projects, I get happiness when the project is complete, when the work is done, and it went off hopefully flawlessly. But the fulfillment on a lot of these have come when I get a random email from an employee, or they post on their social media saying, hey, my company hosted this coffee chat on XYZ topic, and it was almost life-changing for me. It made me feel so good. It was amazing. That's, in my mind, where fulfillment comes in versus that moment of happiness because I completed a project.
And I would even suggest that that moment of fulfillment, that's immutable, right? Like nothing can take that away from you.
No, and years ago, early in my career, I was a recruiter for a major airline, and we had tons of requisitions that we had to fill. And like every good recruiter, my happiness came when I met my numbers, fulfilled my requisitions. But I had so many fulfillment moments when I'd be at an airport, and when you're a recruiter and hiring hundreds and hundreds of people, unfortunately, you don't remember all or any of them. And I'm at an airport one time going through a delay, and the customer service agent called my name and said, "You probably don't remember me, but X number of years ago, you hired me as a reservationist, and now I'm a behind the counter agent, and I'm loving life. I'm traveling. Thank you so much." You can't put a dollar sign on that kind of fulfilling moment.
Yeah, yeah, no, I hear you. I've had a few of those myself. And to your point, that moment of fulfillment, again, sorry to be redundant, but it's immutable. You experience that and nothing can take away that emotion of fulfillment in that moment. Okay, let's move on because we've been talking about the role of culture, the role of belonging. And of course, in your world as Vice President of Culture and Belonging at Hub International, it's a business. That's your job, and it's an important job. So let's tie that to the business. What are the business benefits of culture and belonging?
Sure. And one thing I always talk about with my employee groups is that if you really want to simplify things, there are two things we want to be. We want to be everyone's broker of choice, and we want to be great employees' employer of choice, right? And so, what does that have to do with the business? Well, I think if you're the broker of choice, but leveraging the differences and the different cultures that are out there. And I'll give an example, just looking at data, because everyone's data driven. But I went to the census and found that in the United States, over 60% of hotels, motels are owned by Asians. Little known fact, people, just like people don't know that McDonald's are owned by franchisees, but hotels are, it could have Hyatt on the front door or a Red Roof Inn, but chances are it's owned by an individual or a family. So taking the fact that 60% of the hotels are owned by Asians and the fact that we have a hospitality vertical, I went to our hospitality segment and introduced them to an association of Asian hotel owners, the Asian American Hotel Owners Association, about 30,000 members. What a strategic move. And it's not Skittles and unicorns or illegal DEI. It's being in the face of our business and looking at 30,000 potential new clients. In the Hispanic market, we did the kind of the same thing. And again, going to the census and going to hard data, we found that there are almost 60,000 Hispanic owned construction companies in the United States. Why would you not want to serve them? Why would you not want to be relevant to them? And something I've learned along the way is that it's not always about the best price, product, or service, but you have to develop what I've seen called intercultural IQ, knowing that culture, knowing how to do business in that culture. I remember at one company, before we sent people to Latin America, we told them, please don't do the American thing and just start talking business right away. Be prepared that you may have to focus on family and have kind of personal discussions before business is even discussed. Sending people to Japan in particular, being cognizant of their very polite and indirect communication style. Again, in the United States, if you just look at the numbers, we're a multicultural company. So I read over and over again and saw a gentleman give presentations a number of times because I never get tired of them. But a gentleman named Fons Trampenaars, who wrote a book called Riding the Waves of Culture. It's a fascinating read.
Kevin, as I'm listening to you storytell, give those examples and point out this concept. I love this concept of intercultural IQ. It occurs to me that in your role as VP of Culture and Belonging at Hub International, you're an advisor. You are advising different parts of the business on ways for them to engage and operate and optimize business opportunities by being intercultural, intelligent, and aware so that their engagement and their behavior is well received and it's good for the business.
Well, and you made me think about something else, and it's not, I don't pretend to know everything about every culture, which is the beauty. I think one of the untapped opportunities with these employee resource groups or business resource groups or whatever you're calling them. How many companies, Bernie, do you know that will pay for focus groups? We want to know what fill in the blank community is thinking about this potential product, and let's do a test run of this commercial. Let's see what they think. Well, guess what? You've got focus groups working for you. Why not leverage them? Ask your employees if you're trying to sell to Hispanic owned construction companies, why not ask the Latinos and Latinas working for you what resonates with these folks? Do you know anybody? Can you open some doors for us? It's crazy to me that this doesn't happen more often.
Yeah, that's a great point. Thank you for sharing that. You also talk about allyship as upstanding. So, why don't you unpack that? Let's begin with what do you mean by allyship first and how it's upstanding?
Well, so again, a lot of people will look at, let's take if you have an Asian American resource group, and someone says, well, I'm not Asian, I want to be part of that group. And the group's very welcoming, as I said. But then the next question is, I don't know how to be a good ally. How do I join this group without being insulting or looking like I'm not sincere? And I think the first thing is be honest, admit to knowing what you don't know or not knowing what you don't know. And then the other thing is when you see something that is not right, the question that one of my mentors always asked me is, are you an upstander when you see those situations, or are you just a bystander? So again, I think one of the keys to being an ally, one of the challenges to being an ally is being that upstander. It's easy to be a bystander and kind of click your tongue and say, boy, that shouldn't have happened. But being an upstander, that is a challenge.
So an upstander is sort of like someone who's supportive, someone who's like an ally, right?
Yeah,
So
and
truly.
who will speak up in a safe way, but obviously will speak up and not just let things happen in front of him or her.
So you probably come across this following thought pretty often in your role as VP of Culture and Belonging, and that is people innocently saying something that is a mistake. How do you handle that?
The wonderful gift of language and sayings and slogans and mottos. It's happened to me. I remember years ago, I was in a team meeting and had a boss, nice guy. The meeting was not going very well, and he just said, look, we need to take a time out. This meeting is falling apart. It's going off like a Chinese fire drill. Well, I don't know if you know this about me, but I'm half Chinese. I grew up in Chicago's Chinatown, and I thought he knew that about me. Maybe he didn't. But anyway, so we're on our little break, and I pull him aside in the hallway. And, one of my methods of dealing with things is always giving the person grace first. So I didn't go and wag a finger at him, but I went up to him and I said, boss, can I have a question for you? I'm confused. You said our meeting's going off like a Chinese fire drill. I went to an all Chinese grade school. We had fire drills all the time, and I don't recall any of them going badly. And he was a little speechless in the moment, became very apologetic. And I stopped him right there and I said, not looking for an apology, just looking to raise your awareness. Think about, words are powerful. Think about the things that you're saying. He said, it's just something I used to hear as a kid. And, I just say it. I said, well, take a moment, take a breather, think about these things because words are powerful. They can be uplifting or they can be hurtful.
Yeah. Euphemisms oftentimes can, well, not often, but sometimes can get us in trouble. I think that's a good example. Thank you. What about disability inclusion? It's something that I'm always sensitive to, but I don't wear an HR hat. So I'm wondering, how do you address that?
I address it like a 500-pound elephant in the room because too many people, even going back to the early part of our conversation when we talk about diversity, a lot of people sometimes are not inclusive. They'll talk about diversity and they're actually talking about race and gender.
Mhm.
But when I talk about diversity, it's race, it's gender, it's diversity of thought, it's veteran status, it's on and on and on. And diversity is all inclusive, and that includes disabilities. And it's a community that often gets overlooked in our conversations, despite the fact that, again, I've been so blessed with mentors. One of my early mentors, who was deaf from birth, told an audience that everyone in the room is a mere act of God away from joining her club. I always held that close, and we continue to need to make our workplaces and our neighborhoods more accessible. I have a friend in a wheelchair that to this day has trouble getting into some restaurants and coffee shops. We're not where we need to be. And we also need to not go to the extreme. When people talk about we should open our doors and hire individuals with disabilities, some people like to swing to an extreme and say, oh my gosh, does that mean we have to hire blind pilots? No, you hire someone who can do the job with or without an accommodation. So, again, I'm a big proponent of including that community when we talk about diversity.
And what is access living?
So Access Living is an organization whose board that I currently am serving as board chair. It's what's called a Center for Independent Living. And as that title would connote, we fight for accessibility and for individuals with disabilities to be able to live independent, fulfilled lives. We look at everything from our buses and bus terminals accessible? Are there enough curb cuts? Can a person get into a building with relative ease? And it's just amazing as we look at, we're in the year 2025 and we still have opportunities in the workplace, even just opening our minds to the fact that individuals can do jobs. Companies have proven it. When I was with the airline, we had folks that we hired who were blind working in reservations because they were great on the computer. So, again, I think it's looking at the ability versus concentrating on the disability.
Yeah. And the access part of that really resonates for me, Kevin, because even though I don't have a physical disability, I marvel at how many times I encounter places just in my travels. And I don't necessarily mean going to an airport. I mean, just doing life, getting out of the house. I'll call that travel, where the entrance is a stairway and there's no access for someone who's in a wheelchair. And I realize it would probably take a lot to reconfigure every single building that exists on the planet, but there are some public settings that really do need that. So, to your point, we've made progress and there's room for improvement. And so, thank you for your service as a volunteer for and heading up the board for Access Living.
Well, the other thing to note is oftentimes accommodations that are made for individuals with disabilities get used quite a bit by non-disabled individuals. And you take your example of getting into a building, an accessible door, a door with an automatic plate that automatically opens. That's wonderful for someone in a wheelchair, but think about a parent pushing a baby carriage, or
Yep.
you've got arms full of groceries or laptops or whatever, and now you're trying to manage opening a very heavy door. So it's just been so interesting seeing that the number of accommodations that were designed for individuals with disabilities are actually used universally.
So, Kevin, we have covered a lot of ground in our 30 or so minutes together in this conversation around culture and belonging and inclusivity. So, before I ask you for your contact information for the listener to connect with you, you want to give us a key takeaway for the listener from this conversation?
I think a couple of things, and I was thinking about this. I teach a Japanese martial art called Aikido, which interestingly enough loosely translates to the way of harmony. But there are two sayings that I've heard often in doing this art that I know I've carried with me, and it's really helped me through having work-life harmony and being fulfilled. But one of them is fall down 7 times, get up 8. And then the other is even monkeys fall out of trees. So those, I even had them up on my wall as Japanese sayings. Again, those two things, sometimes I just look at them, nod my head and say, yep. And both have helped me quite a bit.
Yeah, those are great examples. And a comment that I want to make is you have this conversation has really opened my eyes to the power of culture and belonging and how it connects to our fulfillment journey and how we can really seek fulfillment through the lens of culture, the lens of belonging, and how we treat people and being intentional about it. And so many of the examples that you shared really contribute to that. So thank you for that, Kevin. If a listener wants to connect with you and get into your world, where do you want to send them?
I'm easy to find. I'm on LinkedIn, so that's probably the easiest.
Okay. And your LinkedIn handle is Kevin Bradley, the number one. But of course, that is linked up in the show notes page for this episode. So, Kevin, thank you so much for joining me on this episode of the Life of Phil podcast. I look forward to meeting you beyond this video in person at the HR Wellness and Executive Summit in October in Atlanta. And again, just thank you for sharing all of your wisdom and insight with us today.
It's been an extreme pleasure.